From Beam Media in Dallas, Texas, this is the Jack Attack, and I am your host, Jack Everett. And today, in the year 2019, I am finally going to talk about Blade Runner. And Blade Runner is not just one of my favorite movies. Blade Runner is my favorite movie. Blade Runner is a film that isn't just about some story. It's not about action. It's not about dialogue. It is about looking at this world of 2019, this visionary future. The cityscape of 2019 is just buildings randomly exploding. It makes no sense that buildings are just randomly exploding. I mean, why are they exploding? And that's a theme throughout Blade Runner. You see a lot of things that don't really make a lot of sense, but they do look awesome. And of course, then we're introduced to the actual world of Blade Runner, and we see some characters on screen when Holden is interviewing Leon in the Tyrell Pyramid. And just looking at this set alone tells you a lot about the work, the detail put into Blade Runner. I mean, one thing that I always notice when I watch the film is that the chairs in the Tyrell Corporation say Tyrell Corp on them.
Describe in single words only the good things that come into your mind. About your mother?
And it's like, who even thought to put that detail into the film? It's like you could just get some generic office chairs and put them in a set and call that good. But instead they're like, no, we want everything to feel like it's part of this world. And that's a theme that really happens throughout the film, is just you see all these things that might not be practical, but they look awesome. I mean, there's some blimp flying in the air all the time with ads on it. And it's like, in real life, no one would want that. Everyone would be irritated by something like that. I mean, a blimp is cool at a football game or whatever, but no one would want a blimp in their neighborhood, flying around their apartment, making a bunch of noise. There's this shot of just the camera looking at some monitor that's in the spinner. And it's like saying environ blah 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 or whatever, and all this technical beeping and stuff, and it switches to this weird red screen that says purge, and you're like, is that an error in the spinner? Red usually means danger, but it's just some weird detail that someone decided to put in this film. I mean, you could just completely throw out shots like that. You don't need a shot of some monitor showing what's going on with this spinner, but it just adds so much flavor to the film. And of course, early on, we're introduced to one of the most classic, most iconic shots of the whole film, and it's when the camera pans down on the police station. And another thing to notice in this film is the sheer number of extras in the film. Like, there are so many people on screen in this film, and they all feel in place. And so, one has to wonder just how much work was put into the costumes for a character that's just standing in the background somewhere, or just walking in the background. And with that, like, there's just so many details on the sets of the film. If you watch the extras that are included on the Blu-ray and DVD releases, like, they talk about how there's magazine stands where literally every cover of a magazine that's on these magazine stands was designed for this film. Now, my understanding of the sets used in this film is most of them were built on the Warner Studios backlot. And so, as realistic as they look, they were probably actually very small. But one of the weirdest sets, or one of the weirdest filming locations used in the entire film to me, is the interior of the police station, because I believe it is just like a train station. And the simple fact of the matter is, it looks like a train station. So this one, it looks cool. I mean, it looks cool how the camera pans down into Bryant's office. But it's like there's a bunch of benches just sitting in a police station. We see sort of the more luxurious part of the Tyrell Pyramid. We see Tyrell's personal office, and it's just in this what must be a really expensive room. I mean, and there's this artificial owl in there just to add some flavor to the room. I mean, it's sort of like the champagne drinking rich person's type thing where they got some exotic animal as a pet as opposed to some kind of normal animal, or as opposed to like a regular office where there wouldn't really be any animals at all. Now, of course, my favorite, I guess, set or design in the whole film is on the interior of the Bradbury building. It is the hallway that Pris and Sebastian first walk down after taking the elevator. And it's just an absolutely beautiful scene. And it really, to me, sums up like the beauty of this film, just how visual this film is. Like, this is a scene that you could just stare at. I want to talk about the plot. And the plot is interesting because there's not really much to say about it because there isn't much of a plot in this film to speak of at all. I mean, I remember reading articles on Blade Runner when I was trying to figure out why this movie was so great. And there was this interview with Harrison Ford where he said he didn't like the film because he felt like he was a detective that didn't do much detecting in it. But he is right. I mean, it's not like your traditional detective story where there's like A leads to B and B leads to C and so on. For the most part, the investigation that Deckard does just sort of gets handed to him. I mean, the first clue is the Voight-Comp test for Leon, which leads to the Yukon Hotel. And from there, it's the scale, which leads to the snake, and the snake leads to Taffy Lewis's, and then that gets him to track down Zora. And so all of that was sort of a detective line. But then Leon is a freebie after that. And then after that, Deckard doesn't really do anything until he gets the phone call that Sebastian and Tyrell are dead. And so he then goes to check out Sebastian's apartment and the movie ends there. But in terms of plot, I mean, that's Deckard's whole plot. Like, he's just sort of there. He does a little bit of investigating at one point in the film. But then after that, he's just sort of there to tell Roy's story. Now, I don't think that we can ignore one of the weirdest scenes in the film, and that is the love scene between Rachel and Deckard. And it's kind of an interesting scene in that it's like, I know that the actress Sean Young described it as a very violent, and that Harrison Ford was a very violent lover. Any normal woman would probably just be scared out of her mind if a man started, treating her like that. And, to me, this scene was always awkward. It's always weird. I remember a friend of mine described the whole movie as, isn't that the movie where Harrison Ford bangs a robot? And I'm like, I guess that happens in the film, but I wouldn't really describe that as the entire movie. But certainly that's what happens in this scene. I mean, there's intense moments where you're wondering, like, is Deckard just gonna, retire Rachel in the middle of this, like, trying to make out with her situation? I mean, that's what it feels like. To me, the love scene works for the film, even though it's awkward to watch, because it's like, well, Deckard's a killer, really. I mean, he's not necessarily completely cold-blooded at this point, but he still is a killer. He's seen death. He's been a part of it. Rachel at this point is vulnerable. Rachel's now killed Leon, and so she's very vulnerable. She's a replicant. She doesn't trust her own memories. She realizes at this point that she doesn't have the experiences that you and I take for granted. So she's like, maybe this is how things are supposed to be. Maybe this is romance. There's nothing romantic about this scene, but definitely Rachel conveys this idea of confusion about it, and I suppose that's the point. But talking about that romance scene between Deckard and Rachel, we then need to go to the other romance in the story, and that is between Roy and Pris. And there's not much developed in here in terms of what we see on screen, but I think there's a lot of subtext going on from what we do see. Of course, Pris and Sebastian have been hanging out for a while, and then Roy shows up. And then Roy and Pris just kiss each other, and it's just a really awkward kiss. It's not romantic. It's just very physical. It's very juvenile is probably the best way to put it. Now, realistically, Roy and Pris is probably 2 or 3 years old, and Roy, he's at his 4 years. He's at the very end of it all. But still, it's like a 3-year old and a 4-year old. And here they are, and they're going to kiss each other, and it's awkward, and it looks awkward. It doesn't look like romance. It looks like two people that just are experimenting with each other. And so it's a very fitting kiss. I mean, this one's awkward to watch as well, but it's very fitting to the movie because it portrays so perfectly how awkward, these two people are that really don't have that much experience in life. So now that I've talked about some of my favorite scenes in the movie, I want to talk about each of the characters. One of the interesting things about all the box art that you'll see for the film is it always has like, oh, here's the characters. It's got Harrison Ford, Rutger Hauer, Sean Young, Edward James Olmos, Daryl Hannah. And like you look at this and you're like, none of these people are stars except for Harrison Ford. Like, why are they even on the box art? Nobody cares. And so Harrison Ford playing Deckard is one of the least important characters in the film. But I want to talk about him as a character because he's not a likable guy. He's really bland. I mean, really, like, the one thing that Deckard has going for him is that he looks like Harrison Ford, so he's handsome. But that's pretty much it. I mean, he's not a person that you'd want to be friends with. As far as you can tell, Deckard has no friends. He doesn't have any hobbies as far as you can tell except for drinking. I mean, that seems to be what he does when he's at home, drinking and then dreaming about unicorns. I mean, that's his whole life. No one is going to watch this movie and then going to say, I want to be like Deckard. No one's going to watch the movie and think that. So the next character I want to talk about is Gaff. Played by Edward James Olmos. And Gaff is like, it's unclear what Gaff even is. He walks with a cane. Like, with how much Deckard gets beat up by all the various replicants throughout the film, Gaff doesn't stand a chance. It's possible Gaff is just faking the cane to make himself look more vulnerable. But, that's not really the impression I get. The guy walks with a limp. My impression of Gaff really is that he's more of just a police detective or something. He's meant to be following Deckard. He's obviously there investigating with Deckard when they go into the Yukon Hotel. But other than that, we don't really see Gaff, so we don't know what he's up to. At one point, he's with Bryant, and they leave together, and then he shows up at the end of the film, and he shows up in such a way to imply that he's been following Deckard the whole time because he's aware of Rachel. He returns Deckard's pistol to him, so obviously he was right behind him when Roy and Deckard were duking it out. And so Gaff's always there, and then finally at the end of in the last scene that he's in, he reveals he can speak English just fine. But Gaff is certainly an interesting character in the film, but he doesn't contribute a lot to it other than saying one of the most important lines in the film, which is probably why he's even there.
It's too bad she won't live. But then again, who does?
Okay, so I'm going to start talking about the replicants now. And the first one I want to talk about is Zora. You never see Zora on screen with any of the other replicants. She's just sort of off on her own the whole film. The only time that it's even implied that she was with the other replicants is through this photograph that Deckard gets. And the photograph is one of the weirdest parts of the film because it's like Deckard finds a bunch of photographs in the Yukon Hotel. But for some reason, he picks a photograph that doesn't look important at all. All you can really see is someone's arm in it. I think it's Roy's arm, but that's all you can see in the photograph. And it's like, why would Deckard pick this photograph in particular? And he finds this photograph of Zora in it. When Deckard was first put on the case, when he's sitting there with Bryant and he's looking at all the incept photos, well, there's a picture of Zora right there. Okay, Deckard already had access to a picture of Zora. He doesn't need this photo from the Esper machine. Like, it makes no sense that the photo's even in it. I mean, I guess I understand why it's there. It's there to show this cool technology that exists in 2019 that lets you, view a 2D photograph in 3 space. And that's why it's there. I mean, but there's so much wrong with the Esper machine, in my opinion, because the next thing wrong with it is, like, why does Deckard have this in his apartment? It makes no sense. Like, this is probably some kind of expensive piece of equipment, and Deckard just has one lying around in his apartment. But he gets this photograph, and that leads him to find Zora. But it starts with another bizarre thing that makes no sense. And I mean, this is one of the common things throughout the film Blade Runner, is that there are just these scenes that make no sense. And one of them, of course, is Deckard starts talking in a weird voice when he approaches Zora. Like, there's literally no reason for Deckard to be talking in a funny voice when he approaches Zora. Because he's like, I'm on the Confidential Committee of Moral Abuses for the Variety Artists.
I'm from the Confidential Committee on Moral Abuses.
And you're like, why are you talking weird? I mean, it's not like Zora knows Deckard's voice. Yeah, I mean, certainly Zora would know what Deckard looked like before she would be concerned about what he sounded like. So it's like, why is he doing this weird voice? It's like funny, It's funny, but it doesn't feel like it's intended to be funny. Because this is, for the most part, a humorless movie. But nonetheless, then we get the one cool action scene in the movie. And I remember when I was first watching the film, and I was like trying to figure out why this movie was so awesome. I was like, well, he does shoot Zora, and she does fall through all that glass, and it shatters all around her, and she dies, and it's pretty awesome. I mean, Zora's retirement is a very dramatic, very action-packed scene, but it does leave one important question. Deckard fires a bullet and misses, and with how crowded those streets are, surely Deckard hit someone. That question has always been unanswered. Now, Pris first shows up, and I remember the first time I saw this film, I was like, who is this? All of a sudden, we're halfway into the film, and we're being introduced to a new character, and it just looks like some homeless girl that goes to lay down. Later on, we'll learn that it was all part of this scheme by Roy, but, she sort of bumps into Sebastian, and it's just a really awkward conversation that they have with each other, where ultimately Sebastian invites her in. And so we're introduced to these two characters. But I mean, at this point, Sebastian has been taken advantage of by a woman. I mean, he's probably completely inexperienced with women. And then here's this woman, and she's all of a sudden expressing interest in him. I mean, he's talking to her about his problems, and she's like, I like you just the way you are. And so, like, that's the thing anyone would want to hear. Anyone would want to be told that they're perfect the way they are, and he gets that from her.
I like you just the way you are.
Sebastian is probably the one good character. Well, Sebastian and Rachel are probably the only good characters in the whole film that are actually like somewhat virtuous. But of course, that leads us to Pris, and Pris cares nothing for Sebastian, really. I mean, maybe she starts learning empathy, but I think Pris is sort of the more stereotypical replicant. Like, she doesn't actually have empathy. She's just doing whatever Roy tells her to, because, like, she doesn't want to die either. And so if she thinks Roy has a good plan to keep her alive, well, she'll go with it.
But I understand he's sort of hard man to get to.
Yes. Very.
Tyrell's a businessman. The way Tyrell talks, he's like, commerce is our business. Tyrell himself is sociopathic. Tyrell lacks the empathy that his creations also lack. Tyrell has no empathy for his creations. He's willing to create these humans that only have 4 years to live. I mean, think about how cruel that is. If you took any human being and said, well, now you only get 4 years to live, that would be devastating. And Tyrell, of course, has one of my favorite lines of dialogue in the whole movie. And it is when he and Roy are talking at the end of the movie. And they are talking together about what could be done to preserve, to extend Roy's life. And Tyrell just drops a bunch of techno babble. And it's just complete nonsense. I mean, it's just made up for the purpose of the movie. But it sounds very interesting.
Then a repressive protein that blocks the operating cells.
Wouldn't obstruct replication, but it does give rise to an error in replication so that the newly formed DNA strand carries the mutation and you've got a virus again.
So now I must talk about Roy. Roy is the star of the film, without question. The performance that Rutger Hauer does for Roy is stellar. Roy comes off as a 4-year-old. And a 4-year-old with the mind of an adult is what he comes off as. The way he talks to Chew is unnatural. It's a conversation that no one in real life would have.
Yes. Questions.
But it's believable as a conversation that a 4-year-old with a man's brain, with an adult brain, would have. Because it's like, yeah, Roy never developed the ability to have fluid conversations. And so the way he words things is strange, to say the least. Roy is kind of the anti-hero of the film. You know, I mean, we're introduced early on to Roy, and it's just told us that he killed 26 people. So Roy is sinister. Roy is evil, you know, in a lot of ways, but we still empathize with him. And that's the interesting dichotomy of Roy, is that he's both evil and empathetical, sympathetic.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
I mean, the whole point of Roy's final speech is that his death is anticlimactic to everything that led to that point. And that's what it's about. And then, of course, his fear is that everything that he's ever known, everything that he's ever experienced, is just going to be forgotten in that moment. And that's what that scene is all about. And it's like, even Deckard's there to experience his final moments, but he told Deckard 2 things. You know, he's like, I watched C-beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. I watched attack ship on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I mean, he told him 2 things. You know, and that's it. 2 things of Roy's life. Roy's extraordinary life is all that Deckard will remember. And then when Deckard expires, even that will be forgotten. Rachel is like excellently played by Sean Young. And I feel bad for the actress Sean Young, because it's like she got this great role in Blade Runner. She probably thought she was going to go to great places, and then that was it. The very final scene in the film is about Rachel and about Deckard saving Rachel's life. At the end of the movie, after he's been through his experience with Roy, you know, he's there to protect Rachel. You know, you look at the kiss at the end of the movie between Deckard and Rachel when he kisses her to wake her up. It is not the violent kiss that we saw when they were in the apartment together earlier on. It is sort of a gentle kiss. It is a concerned kiss. It's drastically different from the first time that we saw these two involved in some kind of physical relationship. And then, of course, they disappear into the elevator together. And it is the perfect ending of the film. So I think we should end this discussion about the film Blade Runner with the immortal question of Blade Runner. And that is Deckard a replicant or a human? Well, this is a stupid question. in my opinion. Now, when I first saw the film, I didn't know that this was a question. But I learned later on, my assumption, having watched the film, was yeah, Deckard is a human being. I mean, it didn't even occur to me that Deckard could be a replicant, to be honest, when I first saw the film. But I learned, of course, through the internet and through the commentaries on the DVDs and the special features and stuff, that yeah, there's a debate as to whether Deckard is a replicant or not. Apparently, Ridley Scott, the director of the film, seems to think that Deckard is a replicant, and Hampton Fancher, the writer of the film, seems to think that Deckard is a human. And Deckard, of course, dreams about a unicorn, and then Gaff somehow knows about the unicorn. All of this is supposed to be hints that Deckard is a replicant that Ridley Scott threw in there. The idea of Deckard being a replicant bothers me because I feel like the story is stronger if Deckard is a human. Because at the end of the film, Deckard finally empathizes with the replicants. He was chasing after Roy. I mean, he retires Pris and then he chases after Roy. But then at the very end, after Roy dies on his own, Deckard is more empathetic, to the replicants. And so, yeah, he's just going to save Rachel. Well, if Deckard's a replicant, of course he would want to save Rachel because he's going to save his own. But if Deckard is a human, the fact that he changes and decides, to save Rachel, it means that Deckard as a human being learned to empathize with a machine. And so if Deckard can learn to empathize with something he doesn't relate to, that's much more interesting than a replicant empathizing with another replicant. This is my thoughts on Blade Runner. Now, is Blade Runner a film that I can recommend? Well, the answer is no. I never tell people that they should go out and watch Blade Runner because it's like, yeah, Blade Runner is my favorite movie, and I'll tell people Blade Runner is my favorite movie. But if I told someone that they should check out Blade Runner, they'd watch it and they'd be like, well, that was just some weird, boring movie that made no sense. I mean, I know that that's what people's reaction to the film would be. And so, no, I don't normally recommend Blade Runner. I mean, if you've borne with me through this discussion, I do want to at least share with you how much I love Blade Runner and how much I wish that, other people could watch it and enjoy it. But I don't expect other people to watch it and enjoy it. And that's kind of my final thought on Blade Runner. Blade Runner is a film for the fans of Blade Runner. If you watch Blade Runner and you're amazed by it, or even if you just watch it and you want to be amazed by it, Blade Runner's for you. If you watch Blade Runner and you're bored by it and you think it's dumb, except for like the one action scene where Zora gets retired, maybe Blade Runner's not for you. Let me know what you think of the film Blade Runner in the comments below. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Have you never seen it? Has me talking about it made you interested in seeing what it's about? What was your experience discovering Blade Runner? I'd like to know other people's stories about how they discovered Blade Runner. Well, this has been The Jack Attack. I'm Jack Everett. Thanks for watching.